Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to an In Conversation with Minister Di Farmer, Minister for Youth Justice, Education and the Member for Bulimba. I want to start by acknowledging that we're here in Brisbane, Meanjin, on the unceded land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who might be joining us in this conversation today, particularly noting that First Nations children are really significantly overrepresented in the youth justice system, and so this conversation has particular significance to First Nations people in Queensland. It is a really important conversation to be having at this time. I'm really looking forward to talking to the Minister about not just her portfolios of youth justice and education, but also on her reflections in her time in Parliament thus far, having held so many social policy portfolios, which are of course very important to all of us, and having had such an experience now working both in the prevention space, for example, in portfolios like education, and then down sort of stream in the tertiary space, looking at things like child protection and youth justice, and having those portfolios now brought together certainly does give us a lot to talk about. We are broadcasting live today, and we have received a significant number of questions, hoping to get to as many as possible, and also just wanting to note that today's session is being recorded. So by way of introduction, Minister Farmer, who's with me here today, grew up in central Queensland and grew up in an environment where the value of education was really communicated as the most important way to achieve positive outcomes and progress. In December 2023, Minister Farmer was sworn in as Minister for Education and Youth Justice, and the Minister has told me many times about how much she cares about high quality education, how important it is to her personally that everyone has access to high quality education no matter who they are and where they live. So Minister, I am absolutely delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us.
It's a delight for me as well. Thank you, Amy. Yeah.
Minister, you were elected to Parliament as Member for Bulimba in 2009 and then re-elected again in 2015. And obviously over that time you've developed really deep connections into our sector. You've held so many portfolios of importance to our sector. You've had domestic and family violence, child safety, youth and women. You've been Minister for Training and Skills, and now Minister for Education, Youth Justice. I'd love to know a little bit about, I guess, your motivations in the first place for entering politics, and then how that's played through in those portfolios.
Thanks, Amy. And can I just thank you for the opportunity to do this today. I think we've been talking about this for a while, and I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all joining this meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I grew up on Byeli country, which, as Amy says, is in central Queensland, and I know there are a lot of people online today who I have had the great privilege of meeting and working with right across Queensland. And I always say, when people ask me, you know, people will often say, "Oh, politics, well, what a terrible job." But I have to say, one of my greatest pleasures is actually the amazing people that I meet, and there are many people I know online today who are those people who I am constantly amazed at what you do, just constantly. So, so thank you to all of you. But in a way, this is the jobs I've been doing, the portfolios I've had, and where I am now is almost a bit like a dream, and because it's actually what I'm doing now is actually the reason I got into politics. And you've heard me tell the story, Amy. I grew up in a very supported family in central Queensland. Nothing bad had ever happened to me. I did speech pathology. I graduated. I got a job in inner city Brisbane, which at that time was not the trendy place that much of inner city Brisbane is now. It was very socially disadvantaged, and I was being referred, you know, children who might be 8, 10 years old and hadn't started speaking yet, but no one had noticed because it was literally about number 97 on the list of priorities. They were kids in DV situations. There was poverty, homelessness, hunger, you know, disengagement from education. And I quickly realised that really, unless you could address those systemic issues, the fact that that child couldn't speak was irrelevant in a lot of ways, and that it was actually only, you know, an entity like government working at a systemic level that could really actually needed to make that kind of change. And so it was the reason I, you know, chose the party that I did, because I felt it best represented those views. But you know, and as I became a local member and was able to work with those issues as a local member. But I remember when Anastasia Palaszczuk, the then Premier, she'd already invited me to join the Cabinet, and it's a bit of a process. You sort of queue up all the people going to be ministers, you know, to work out what portfolio you're going to get given. And I knew if I got primary industries, you know, well, I was going to be very good at that, even though I wasn't across it. But she asked me if I would take on child safety, prevention of domestic and family violence, and youth justice. And I actually cried, which was, you know, could have been career limiting, but I had to explain to her afterwards that I still actually get a bit teary about this, that she was actually giving me the opportunity to make change in something that was the reason. I said, I can't believe I still get emotional about that. For me to make change in areas that had completely influenced my whole life and what I did. And as you were saying, Amy, in the intro, I've had the opportunity in a few different policy areas now to actually do that, and realising now that it's actually about the partnerships that government is then able to have with people like QCOSS, but, you know, so many of the organisations who are online now, that at that level you can actually make a difference, you know. And so so to be here now is just it's still, I am still caught with just that opportunity. Yeah.
Well, I don't think tears are career limiting, because obviously you've gone on to hold many really important portfolios and be known as a really credible and trusted minister with really strong connections outside of government as well as within government. But we've seen quite a lot of shifting and moving in that time, not just ministers moving portfolios, but also government departments shifting and changing. You spoke about when you came in as minister, you had youth justice, child protection and women's safety together, and now those things are all separate. I wondered if you could comment a little bit about how you see, because I guess in our sector we work with a person, you know, and a person isn't divided by the type of you know, characteristics they might have. They don't fit into a box. They may have a need for all kinds of services and supports, as we all do at different times in our lives. So can you talk to me a little bit about what your observations are in relation to what changes when things are unpicked or stitched together, and how those different social policy departments do or don't work well together?
Yeah, look, it's a question that comes up a lot, and Peter Coldrake in his report sort of just talked about the impact of having machinery of government changes and trying to limit that. And I know when Stephen Miles came in as new Premier, he was very, very determined to minimise the number of MOGs. And so I guess from the government side of things, and I want to go to that point you were making about what that means for an individual and even for agencies. Maybe not so much QCOSS because you're used to traversing the agencies, but I think for a lot of organisations on the ground, from a government point of view, I think there's, it's about trying to actually find the common ground and put things together that will actually allow, smoother decision making. So when I first came in with child safety, domestic violence and youth justice, essentially we all know that the underlying reasons that people end up in those systems are all quite similar. And so, so there is much to be said for actually then, grouping that overlap together. And of course, youth justice, for instance, has been unpicked in different ways. I think the operations of the department, I'll take youth justice is probably the best example, youth justice. The operations of the department really don't change, but certainly the administration around where people sit and who's looking after what and making sure the money's going to the right place, that does take a small group of people a long time. And we're really conscious that, particularly on the departmental staff who are doing the doing, that work is not impacted. But I look now, and I obviously have education and youth justice now. That was the Premier's very, very deliberate decision, and I'm the only minister in Australia who actually has both of those. And I was very, very strong in discussing that with the Premier as well. And I think probably education in terms of rather than the causes but the opportunities it provides are much more far-reaching than possibly any other portfolio, and because we know that while not every child who's disengaged with education is is going to end up in the youth justice system, every child in the youth justice system is disengaged with education. And I think there's a fact that the strongest determinant that they will is if they're disengaged from education by the time they're 7. So again, that opportunity to really combine portfolios in a way that will have maximum benefit. And you could look at it in 1,000 different ways. So certainly I think it's important for governments and people at my level to understand the impact of those MOGs and to always be conscious of minimising so you can be absolutely sure you're getting on with the business. But acknowledge too for organisations dealing with government, that's a thing. But of course, the average person who might need to engage with 4 or 5 different government departments, and it's people online now who are having to, sort of speak to 4 or 5 different people. That's not the way life works. And I think the average person probably thinks, oh, well, government just works really seamlessly. And I know that's not necessarily the case all the time, so apologies for that. Yes.
Yeah, so I guess that's really interesting to hear, that the Premier, that was a very deliberate pairing of youth justice and education, and that fact that you said about the strongest indicator of whether a child's going to be connected to the youth justice system is disengagement from education by age 7. Are there really concrete examples that you could point to where sort of identifying that overlap or connection has been sort of then led to sort of outcomes or strategies or ideas that are going to have a longer term impact on, focusing on education as a way to prevent interaction with the justice system?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because often you don't have statistics on what was averted.
Exactly, yeah.
But we know, for instance, a lot of the work we've been doing, sort of in the mid, young people in their mid-teens who are in the youth justice system, who are, they've had 14 or 15 years of being exposed to, domestic violence, poverty, homelessness, one or both parents incarcerated, disengagement from education, that the really intensive case management that we're doing with those young people now, we are getting such a really strong turnaround. There's over 40% reduction in offending, 72% reduction in offences against the person. But a key part of that is engaging them with education. And not, I think there's recognition more and more that education can't be mainstream schooling for everybody. That you'll see the big package we announced at the end of last year, that just really there's a whole lot of kids that don't fit into mainstream school. And so that's why we're doing flexi spaces, more pathways, colleges, alternative learning, really working on attendance and engagement. But even going further back now, and I could talk to you about, what we're even doing now, just because we've got the two departments together, physically linking up kids who've been in detention centres with schools, before and after, and what we can do. But now we've got our early years strategy, and there's been increasing recognition, which has been an absolute passion of mine, that you get the early years right. So by the time they're hitting kindy in school, they are not starting further behind. And even free kindy, which initially I guess everyone was seeing as a cost of living measure, and it is. And I actually dread to think how many more kids wouldn't have been going to kindy this year, when cost of living is such a big issue. But now it means that every child can get 15 hours of free kindy, every 4-year-old. The fact that those kids can now start school on an even playing field, and there's not an early education teacher who wouldn't tell you that they could tell the difference between the kids who'd been to kindy and the kids who couldn't, who literally never catch up. They just never catch up. But now, of course, with our early years strategy, we're saying, before you even get to school, we are going to be putting the systems in place to make sure we know you might be a bit at risk. We're putting the wraparound support so that they actually have that we've actually now, got some, and we're rolling them out as we speak, got the structures in place, like the family support coordinators and those kinds of people who can see a child immediately who's at risk and wrap their arms around them and the environment around them, so that those first few years especially are a good start for them.
Yeah.
I mean, we know, and it always shocks people, and I'm always keen to contribute the early intervention and prevention side to what can be an awful debate about youth crime. And I always say this because I know it shocks people. A third of the kids who get to youth detention literally can't read, and not just poor readers. They literally cannot read. They can't read a sign. They can't read label in the supermarket. They can't read the forms they sign for court. They literally, they have no functionality in life. So the power of education, and the stories when I talk to those teachers about how they can help a young person to leave youth detention with functional reading, the difference that makes to your life and to your ability to have a positive experience in the world is massive. So there are so many little examples of that. But again, those big systemic changes, setting up a child to do the best they can do in school, and having points along the way where we can identify the kids who are struggling. And I'm just hugely proud of that, you know, those pieces of work which catch those kids. Long way to go, and life is not simple, but, you know, just to have that in place.
There's so much in what you just said, and I'm now
thinking about where you want to go
take
with
the
that.
conversation in so many directions.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too political, but you did reference sort of the really confronting, and you didn't use these words, but alarming debate that occurs particularly in the lead up to an election in Queensland in relation to youth justice. And we saw, just recently the LNP announced their youth justice policy. One of the aspects of it is about improving services and supports for young people upon release from detention. So making sure there is that more intensive support so that young person hopefully re-enters the community with the support that they need. Could you talk to me a little bit about what's already in place in Queensland to make sure that young people do have those connections to education, to their families, to the resources and supports that they need?
And look, it's an interesting one because there is actually no detail on the LNP's policy. And, you know, their policy is really, I think there's 4 slogans, and we are still totally unclear on what it's about. So, and now that you've opened the door for it, we really have to...
It's my fault.
No. We have to put on the table
Yeah.
adult time for adult crime.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, but I don't imagine there is a person on this viewing that thinks that's okay. And in fact, you know, I know there are a lot of people in my community who are absolutely appalled by it. But anyway, I don't want to sort of, you know, go and start being too political. But $175 million with no detail whatsoever. We spend nearly $1 billion on early intervention and prevention programs, including every child who's on orders actually has a case management plan when they actually leave detention. For the kids who aren't in YJ's remit, we know from a legal perspective, any engagement in our programs can be voluntary only. But the structures that we have in place for those young people, including the multi-agency collaborative panels, our early action groups, even our youth co-responder teams, who actually have a cross-agency eye on that young person, is there in place, and we continue to do more on that. But you know, the average case plan for a young person who's on orders leaving detention can often go for longer than 12 months. And I think, you know, a really great example of that is our intensive case management, where you know, we have our youth justice workers, they can have only up to 5 young people that they're working with at any one time. They work 5 to 6 days a week with that young person and their family, and it's often about 12 months before they actually see the turnaround. And the impact of that is enormous because it's obviously not just changing the situation for that young person, it's actually addressing the root causes of their offending. And at the same time, we are also having an impact on siblings who may be in the pipeline for actually entering the system. So working with that dysfunction. And we know, like, if a kid's been exposed to those sorts of issues for 14 or 15 or 16 years, there's no dinky little program that's going to turn that around. It has to be sustained sustained work. But I think the basis of our approach is, one, we want to stop those kids getting into the system in the first place. And so things like our early years strategy, so we're starting from conception. Even a change in alcohol consumption during pregnancy, when we know so many kids end up with FASD who are in our system. Starting from conception now, addressing the link between disengagement from education and youth justice, the kids who are already in the system, providing that intensive case management. And we've seen, and I'm always big on data. You know, I couldn't count the number of suggestions that have been put to me about what would fix, you know, the youth justice system. But I am big on data, as you know, Amy. I need evidence to show that something is working. And if it is working, we'll do more of it. And if it isn't, we'll stop. And so intensive case management, for instance, we actually keep on extending the number of locations because it is making a difference. But I need to address, you know, that it's a long game when you're starting from conception, but to see the evidence that is now around a number of those initiatives, and then to see that we're applying those same things to the young people who are leaving detention. And look, it would be my absolute goal that if you leave detention, we never see you again. And that's what those programs, which are tested and based on evidence, are about. But also, you know, we know that our new detention centres that we are planning, and I appreciate, you know, there are people online who for whom the principle of detention is anathema. For the ones we are planning, they're therapeutic models, and we've seen, you know, evidence from, particularly from Spain, actually. We've seen evidence about models that actually really make a difference, and that's actually the goal too. That you know, they're receiving that absolutely, you know, very, very good and integrated service when they're in detention. They get support when they come out. So it's always this long journey and continuum, isn't it?
Yeah. And then there's obviously the underlying, you know, root causes, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And I think we've had quite a few questions coming through that are about that intersection of education and youth justice and some of the characteristics of the young people we know are sort of not served by the education system necessarily, and then ending up in tertiary systems. So in particular, people are asking about children with disabilities, particularly neurological conditions or mental health issues. I guess we know more and more that about these kids that are ending up in the system, and some of the behaviours which are antisocial, which are criminalised, can be directly connected back to some of the ways that impairments manifest themselves in behaviours. Can we talk a little bit about what we're doing in particular to make sure that in the education space that children don't become excluded from education because of impairments or disabilities, and then in the youth justice space that we're really making sure kids are assessed and diagnosed and have the supports and services that they need?
No, it's a really important question, and probably would be ignoring the elephant in the room not to talk about the education bill, which I introduced at the beginning of this year, which had was focused on a range of things, but one of the key amendments was around school disciplinary absences and there being a support program, and some other sort of constraints that we wanted to put around that. There'd been 2 years of consultation on that before I became minister, and I've seen all the records of meetings and the notes and things, and it seemed very comprehensive to me. But it became really clear as soon as I introduced it that there was a huge reaction, and a lot of people very upset by it. And there was also a separate thing from homeschoolers who felt equally upset, but completely different issues. And as a minister, I mean, there is no way I'm going to introduce a bill or proceed with a bill that just upsets so many people. There's clearly something going on. And so the process that we've now got in place gets everyone around the table together. And I think it's the first time people have been in a room together. So we had people, and I set up a round table which was about that. As you know, we've had great participation from QCOSS to have, the teachers and principals and people representing them, but also the people who represent the kids with disabilities and the other kids that can create havoc in the classroom and are actually the subject of the SDAs. And my goal in the first meeting was actually to just get everyone in the same room and recognising each other's issues. I thought it would probably take, maybe a few meetings, but then what are we going to actually do about this? And I have to say, and I should have known, it was just a great meeting because everybody understood each other's perspective, and it was very respectful and very solutions focused. And so I think you'll see, I'm looking at making some announcements about that. We've got a meeting, which I think you'll be coming to, Amy, at the end of this month. And I think there's been a lot of work with everybody behind the scenes. And I think we're actually, coming to a point where people feel in agreement. And I guess I'm always very careful now to say every child, no matter who you are or where you are in Queensland, deserves the same access to a high quality education. And thank you for reflecting that in your comments. And I don't know a single teacher or principal who doesn't agree with that. However, those kids are often just too hard. I was really shocked to hear when I first became minister that there is no special education training for teachers. And your average teacher has no training at all in working with kids with disabilities. That's one thing straight up and down we have to fix. But I think recognising that we need supports. The recent budget, we've invested about $500 million around students with disabilities, which is not only about the physical space in mainstream schools, but also actually having, those specialist staff, 2,000 specialist staff, speechies, OTs, counsellors, specially trained teachers. As part of our early years strategy, we're looking at having that family support. I mean, we know that some of our projections from the Commonwealth have said to us that within 5 years, perhaps 30% of the kids in mainstream schools will have a disability.
Wow.
So we actually, we need to address that. But additionally, if there are kids who it just doesn't work, and there are a number of people doing homeschooling because of those issues, but that we have those other physical alternatives that they can actually, so it's again recognising that thing that mainstream school does not work for everybody. We strongly support parents having a choice about where they send their kids, but making sure we've got that support for everyone concerned.
Wow, there's a lot to be done, isn't there?
Yeah. But we're really, and I think just recognising the two sides of the argument and having everyone in together. People are including some of your members have put proposals to me, and I've said, I'm not doing anything unless everybody agrees. There's no point putting something in place if everyone in the ecosystem is not owning it.
Yeah, that's so true in so many spaces, isn't
absolutely.
it? You think about how you can make, for example, a diversionary program work for younger kids in the youth justice system. You're going to have to get the police to agree to divert the kids.
That's exactly right.
So,
and the courts.
That's
right.
Yeah. So we've seen a lot of action this year in terms of important intersecting or connected strategies in your portfolio areas. So we saw the community safety plan, and it made reference to the youth justice strategy, which was released after that. And we also saw the release of putting Queensland Kids First. So 3 very closely related pieces. Can you talk to me a little bit about the vision that those strategies and plans sets up for Queensland across the next 4 years?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll start with the smallest one first, though calling it the smallest, is arguable. So the youth justice strategy was obviously something we went to the last election with, and we were due, I think, to deliver it probably by the end of last year. And as you know, Amy, I've said consistently, we had, in the process of last year, we'd already announced the Youth Justice Select Committee. We knew that the Auditor General was conducting an evaluation of the services. And so I'd always said, well, we can't produce a youth justice strategy until all of that is over. It would be presumptuous. And so that's been released just recently. And we very much said that is a living document. And I want to just acknowledge the members, and including you, Amy, of my Youth Justice Reference Group, a really broad and diverse group of people, including victim rep. We've obviously got someone from the Retail Association. They're really, really robust conversations, and I am always guided by the evidence, by expert advice from people on that group and others. So the Youth Justice Strategy reflects what we're doing now. It reflects our priorities for future action, which is around First Nations people, people with disabilities and young girls. But it means that where evidence comes to hand, or where the expert advice changes, then we're not stuck. That's, we will revisit it every year at budget time, but we're not stuck on, well, we have to do it this way. And I think just in the times that I've been Youth Justice Minister, you will have seen that I've very much, let's do more of that thing because it works. So that will be sort of a living document, and we will get more evidence as we go. The community safety plan, and they're putting Queensland Kids First, have to say, the Premier that is absolutely passionate about those things, and youth justice strategy, and one of the key things about both of those plans is about government agencies working together and in partnership with the non-government sector. That because he understands, and as we all do, that it is a challenge. We cannot work in silos, and so it actually sets up systems that require agencies to work together. Right. So, for instance, when a child is born who we know is at risk, it might be the community health nurse that does the home visits, but if the community health nurse knows there's a problem, then we swing in with the early childhood family coordinators and we wrap those agencies around them. So a lot of those systems are about bringing everyone together, because that's just the best way it can be for the person for whom the services is aimed. And so obviously the community safety plan addresses the full gamut of services that the community wants and expects in community safety from victims, and we are doing more and more with victims. We needed to, you know, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm just so thrilled that Beck O'Connor, who was just such a leader in the community sector, I'm so thrilled, and John Rouse was wonderful too, but Beck will come into that position with just you know, so much to offer, but more to be done in that space. But it goes to also the frontline policing, and I know in Bob Atkinson's report, he always said everything we do in youth justice must be bookended by community safety and community confidence. And so that plan addresses that. And of course, putting Queensland Kids First, another passion project of the Premier, recognising we've got to start from the beginning, because often we don't see eyes on kids until they get to school and it's too late. So, but again, those same underlying principles.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think back on Bob Atkinson's work and the previous youth justice strategy, because similar people that sit around the table now and provide that advice that you spoke to, Minister, have been involved.
I know, I set up the group actually.
You did. So the pictures in the previous strategy, you know, many of the same people are still there.
Thank you to all those people.
Yes. And I think the sector has, even broadly, when we have talked about what should be in a new strategy, our sector was pretty supportive of what was in the strategy informed by Bob Atkinson's work. But then if we go to the Audit Office report, some of the findings out of there were more about implementation of the strategy rather than the strategy itself necessarily. What has the government learnt from the Audit Office's report, and what are some of the sort of then actions that will be taken?
So the Audit Office report examined services. It was operational. It examined services and programs up until the 23rd of June last year. And so many of those things have been on a journey. And I think, you know, when we're seeing, again, going to the data, when we're seeing some of the results of the programs that we've had in place, you know, like your transition to success, your youth co-responder, the intensive case management, you know, we're actually seeing some fantastic outcomes. Even at that point last year, you know, in the youth detention centres, for instance, we were 50 staff down. In fact, at one point, I think we were over 100 staff down across 2 detention centres. So the quality even of the support and services that you could provide in those centres was really challenging. We are now, I think Bob G and I came in about May last year, I think, back into the portfolio. We're now 120 staff over in the youth detention centres. So what we are able to do in that space and what we are able to avoid doing as well is fundamentally different. Those staff in youth detention centres now have, I think, the best working conditions, pay and working conditions of any in Australia, and they should, because they work in really challenging circumstances. Even things like, you know, we've obviously appointed our peak body now, which I was absolutely determined to do, as you know, as soon as I was reappointed to the position. The difference that will make in terms of addressing the just terrible overrepresentation of First Nations people in the youth justice system, and galvanising the sector to work together on priorities will be huge. So a lot of those kinds of operational things, even the structures that support those things, we've kind of moved along a bit. And of course, because I commissioned Bob to, I remember ringing him at about midnight one night. I don't think I even really knew him very well, but I talked to someone who said he'd be okay for me to ring him at midnight, and so I can't remember what was going on at the time. The work he did, we weren't really talking about early intervention and prevention at that stage, and I feel so excited that I look back and think, okay, well, what have we achieved? And I look back, and that was, Bob came up with such a widely regarded, highly regarded report, and it put early intervention and prevention on the map. And then we put $500 million towards doing it, and so many of the services coming back in. What I love too is that at that point, no one was talking about it. It was all lock them up and throw away the key. You couldn't even mention early intervention and prevention. I would be screamed down in a crowd, or I'd go to press conferences with people just abusing me, and I would just keep on with it. Coming back in, the conversation, the narrative in the broader community, the understanding in the media of how important it is, the buy-in of key agencies to that at the most senior levels of government is absolutely huge. And so I think that progress, the auditors' reports are always really important. You've got to learn from them, and you've got to look at that and think, okay, well, have we got to do something there? Have we moved along? Because we kind of knew that bit anyway. But also being able to look at that sort of the strategic level policy direction and buy-in, I think is always important. But I'm always, I've had robust conversations with you, Aimee, and many people who are on this meeting, and I hope that I'm always a person who will accept criticism. I'll give it back if I think it's unfair. But it's the only way as a minister.
Yes.
It's the only way I'm going to make sure I'm doing as good a job as I can.
Yes, no, yeah. I think everyone would acknowledge that the dialogue with you is open and robust, and that you're available, and we're all really grateful for that, Minister.
Thank you.
You talked about the appointment of QCOSS as the Youth Justice Peak, which QCOSS was delighted to see.
No, it's great.
Given the overrepresentation of First Nations children in the system. I wonder if this might be I'd love to see someone point to another example where we actually have a First Nations lead on an issue which has a disproportionate impact on First Nations kids, but also impacts other kids. And so it's going to be so incredibly exciting to see what the change is when the whole system is, when the advice is First Nations led, and we get the opportunity to learn from that leadership and follow that. I wondered if you could maybe comment a little bit about why you wanted a Youth Justice Peak and what your view of the role of a peak is.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's a few different answers. I mean, I obviously work with peaks a lot and have over my portfolios. Look, I have to be honest and say one of the most immediate, and we've had this conversation, is I'm pretty appalled by the standard of debate about youth justice. And look, no one's going to listen to me as a politician, but I see people regularly making comment about youth crime in the community, and some of it can be quite provocative and ill-informed. And those people have a right, and there's all sorts of reasons that people are asked to comment. As a community, as a society, we're all part of this solution, and we need to be informed about what this is all about and what the real issues are. And so I was very keen to make sure that there was a credible body who was recognised as the peak body for youth justice, representing a range of views, but collectively expressing a expert, evidence-based, and informed by people who are working in this space, really keen for that position to be clear in people's minds and to help educate, including educate governments and future governments. And there are some so many credible people in the sector, including you and people from QCOSS Aimee, and who are active participants in that public debate, which is so important. But I was keen. I think awareness is really important and contributing in a constructive way to the debate, because that's the only way we'll actually get solutions. But quite aside from that, there are generic issues like addressing First Nations, addressing the issue of overrepresentation of First Nations people in our system. And they are, complex issues. It signals this is a priority. And I was looking through the questions that you'd very kindly sent me beforehand, and some of them I didn't necessarily have an answer to, but I thought this is just sort of thing a peak body could be looking at. And so I think it's important from that point of view. But some of those also systemic issues like workforce. How do we plan, across all services, how do we plan for the future? What decisions does government have to make? What decisions does the sector or training institutions? What are the skills that we need? What are the issues for rural and remote Queensland? Because we are so decentralised. And those things, many of your organisations working in that space, you're each grappling with them. QCOSS, I know, does. Each grappling with those issues. But we need to address them systemically as well. So to have a peak body that represents the interests and actually collects the voice of the sector across all of those things, I think is really important, so that we can have that sort of overarching look at it. So I'm so excited. I was so thrilled, and I'm just so excited to see what happens with that, and they're going to do a great job.
They sure will.
Yeah.
So, look, I'm going to have to ask this question, Minister, given my long interest in human rights law and human rights generally. Human rights are about how we, as everyone knows, that interaction between citizens and government, and what are the limits as to the things that government should do to make sure that we all have our lives characterised as much as possible by freedom, respect, equality and dignity. And I think since the Human Rights Act was introduced in 2009, we have seen a growing human rights culture in Queensland, only the third jurisdiction in Australia to have a Human Rights Act. And in some of those important policies that we talked about before, strategies I should say, as it should always be the case, we saw in the Putting Queensland Kids First strategy, the human rights framework embedded into that strategy. But, I guess the critique is that human rights should be available to all of us and have particular importance to the most vulnerable people in our community. And arguably, the children in our youth justice system are the most vulnerable people in Queensland. And to see a youth justice strategy that doesn't refer to our Human Rights Act, and then to see our Human Rights Act suspended on 2 occasions in Queensland, both in relation to youth justice. On the back of a pandemic, we didn't need to suspend it in the face of a pandemic, and yet it was in relation to youth justice. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about how we as a community, as a whole of community endeavour, build a human rights respecting, response to youth crime.
And I think in a lot of ways, many of the things that we've talked about today and about informing and contributing to a well-informed and constructive debate is a key part of that. Absolutely, human rights consideration is fundamental to everything we do. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but every cabinet decision, every cabinet submission that comes before us has a human rights, like there has to be evidence of how we're adhering to human rights, or if there are any concerns about human rights, regardless of what the submission is. And so I think not only the passing of that act, but the fact that that is present for every single decision that we make, I think is pretty good evidence. I'm going to go straight to the one which we're not specifically mentioning here, but I'm just going to go straight to it, so we're kind of really, and you're being very well mannered about it, maybe. But obviously there was a decision last year which overrode human rights. I think people who know me would have known how traumatic that was to make that decision. It was deeply traumatic. But it was also, on the face of it, I believe that I was actually making the best decision for the human rights of the young people involved. And so just to clarify for people who may not be aware of it, there had been custom and practice over 30 years that the Director General of Youth Justice can make a decision about which young people are transferred to youth detention from the watch house. So which was based on an understanding of law, and without going into all the details, there was a challenge to that belief, and it led us to get advice that in fact that would be under, because we then had a Human Rights Act, which was the framework of reference, that in fact that would be breaching human rights. However, in practicality, it is absolutely essential that the Director General has that ability. So if we've got beds available in the Youth Detention Centre and they are for girls and there are only boys in the watch house, the Director General is not going to send those boys over there, because if we had sort of changed it around, it would have meant every child was basically transferred straight to the watch house. If there's only girls spots there, he's not going to send boys who are in the watch house. If there are only 13-year-olds in the watch house and the beds that are available are with hardened criminals who are 17, we're not going to send those kids. If there's a young person who is at risk and we don't have an opportunity in the detention centre to look after that young person safely, then the Director General at all times is going to be making that decision. And he also needs to control the numbers. So literally, if every child could have come to the Youth Detention Centre, we would have very quickly ended up with kids sleeping on concrete floors. We might have been able to last a couple of weeks before it would have descended into chaos, and would have put the young people and the staff absolutely at risk. And so the weighing up of those two options was in favour of the custom and practice that had been developed on an understanding of the law, which we believed and still believe are the ones that best protect the safety of the young people in the watch house and the young people and staff in the detention centres. Now, because I never shy away from if people want to talk to me about something, I'm there, I'm up for it. So I also knew how people were going to feel about that, because I know how passionately people feel about this. So that was an instance where recognising by the letter of the law, and completely understand the people who believe it should be the other way, that you should just be able to transfer them, but looking at the reality, I could not in all conscience allow that to happen. The risk of physical harm, or even possibly, worse, was too high. So I guess in that very long answer, it's about the fact that there is evidence on literally hundreds, if not thousands of occasions where, the Human Rights Act has been upheld, and is always. If it is not, believe me, it is because of a very usually agonising and reasoned decision about it. So I just wanted to really specifically talk about that one, because that is the most recent one, and it was a profile one, and I know the anguish it caused to a lot of people, and I'm really sorry that was the way it was.
Minister, thank you so much for going there with
Thank
us.
you.
And thanks so much for making the time
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
us today.
It's great.
Always
Yeah.
such a pleasure to talk to you, to have those big conversations. We really appreciate it. It is all we have time for, so I'd like to thank all of you for attending too. If you want to keep engaging with QCOSS in relation to our youth justice work, please go to our Raise the Age Queensland website, and please do sign up. Thanks all so much for your time, and have a wonderful afternoon.